Hello, Buzzkillers. Hello, everyone out there. This is Professor Buzzkill, busting myths, taking names. And, no matter how much you study World War II and the effects of World War II, there's so much more left to study. We often say on this show it's not only the worst thing that ever happened in world history in terms of the number of people who died, but it's also one of the most complicated things in world history. And the depth of information about World War II is just, infinite. So we're very fortunate to have on the line Professor Susan Grunewald, whose new book, From Incarceration to Repatriation, German Prisoners of War in the Soviet Union. She's here on the line with us and willing to talk about this tremendously interesting subject, tremendously deep subject. Dr. Grunewald, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Again, we just cannot find the bottom for all these World War II studies, and I think that that's so important to talk about in general. But I think your interesting topic about the German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union is so fascinating because unlike most prisoners of war, or at least I think most prisoners of war, there's an exchange more or less at the end of every war, every, if you will, normal war. One side exchanges prisoners trying to get its own prisoners back with the other side. But this doesn't happen with German POWs in the Soviet Union after 1945.
No, it doesn't. The last men who were held by the Soviets were returned in 1956, so 11 years after the end of the war, which is a surprisingly long amount of time to hold a prisoner.
Oh, yeah.
It's not, though, I do need to mention, it's not entirely unique that the Soviets held on to their Germans and other Axis prisoners as well. The Japanese POWs, for example, were held until, I believe, also 54 or 56 for the last ones. But all of the Allied victor nations, they held on to their German prisoners of war for a little bit after the Second World War. So the U.S., I think we returned all of ours by 1945, 1946. The British, I believe, returned theirs in 47, and the French returned the last of theirs by December 31st, 1948. All of the Allies made an agreement before the war was over that they could hold their prisoners until December 31st, 1948.
Now, by the way, when you say Japanese originally, the first part of your sentence, you mean the Japanese POWs in Russian,
yes,
in Soviet prison camps, not right.
Sorry,
okay,
yes, and important to stress, yes, there are a lot of different countries holding lots of different captives of different nationalities, so it gets confusing really quickly.
Well, I think our listeners might initially react to this by saying, well, the Soviet Union suffered so badly from the German invasion, the Soviet Union suffered so enormously in terms of the number of dead. It's not surprising that one of the last things on their priority list was, let's send these German POWs back. But you show in this fascinating complex, and by complex I mean that in a very, very positive way, fascinating complex analysis of this whole period and whole topic, there's a lot more going on than just sort of punishment for the Germans for having invaded the Soviet Union.
Certainly. I mean, punishment is obviously there, right? They're the enemies. There is an understanding that they need to contribute in some way to post-war justice in a variety of ways, right? Like Stalin going in as we lead towards the Cold War, the German question, what to do with Germany itself, questions of reparations and so on and so forth. And those Germans who were able-bodied, and I stress the ones who were able-bodied, who were held in Soviet captivity, they were seen as a way to contribute to post-war reconstruction and post-war justice, both visibly for the Soviet population who saw these men toiling to rebuild what they destroyed,
right,
but also economically. One of the things that I think is lesser known or hasn't really been known until certainly the Gorbachev era and then the opening of the former Soviet archives towards the end of his rule and also after the Soviet collapse in 1991 is the extent of damages to the Soviet Union during World War II.
Yeah.
Stalin intentionally downplayed the level of damages, and he publicly gave a much, much lower number of Soviet deaths during the war. So Stalin gave some figure, I think it was under the published figure of what the German war dead were, and then it was increased slightly under Khrushchev, it was increased slightly under Brezhnev, and it was only brought up to the closer, more conservative estimates of almost 27 million under Gorbachev. So it's a lot of people who were killed during the war. The Soviet Union, it's a victor nation, but it ends up losing about a quarter of its total physical assets during the war as well, right? Hundreds and thousands of cities and towns, factories, kilometers of railroads, everything where the German army had occupied the territories was in rubble and ruin. So the Soviets relied on these able-bodied, anybody who was ill or injured, those were the ones first to be returned after capitulation, because the Soviet government had no interest in sustaining them with the non-existent resources they had. But anybody who was able-bodied, those men were deployed for post-war reconstruction because every single human who could contribute was necessary.
Yes, but I can imagine that, we're looking at the Japanese soldiers being released earlier and the German soldiers not being released till later. And someone could argue, although again, it's sort of an argument without looking into the evidence, that there's a lot of revenge here. Yes, let's put these able-bodied German POWs to effectively slave labor because they're the German POWs. And they're the ones that help cause all the destruction. So you point out very clearly in the book that it's difficult to weigh Soviet motivations, and it's difficult to say either or, and it's probably both. That yes, they need to rebuild the country and they need a labor force to do it, but it's kind of, and I don't want to be flippant about this, but it's kind of handy that there's an ethnic group that they don't like because of the war available as labor force.
Yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily singling out the Germans, right? So Austrians, Italians, Romanians, Hungarians, Japanese, if you are a captured POW and you're able-bodied, you're deployed to the labor force.
Okay.
One of the things that is going for the Germans is that they are the largest number. So that certainly factors into this as well. One of the other things, too, is that during the war, there's an active anti-German hate propaganda campaign while the Soviets are fighting the Germans, right? There is a famous poem called Kill Him, and the refrain of the poem is Kill him, kill a German. So it's not subtle at all. But towards the end of the war, the hate campaign is drawn back, and Soviet officials are always very cognizant to never say German, we're fighting the Germans. It's always we're fighting the fascists or the Hitlerites. There's an attempt to extract the Nazi ideology from the German people as a whole, because there is an understanding that the war will eventually end. And then what will you do when you refashion Germany once Hitler is defeated? You don't want to alienate an entire population of people.
Yes, and then as it turns out, the Soviet Union is the first army in Berlin, and that's one of the reasons we have East Germany after the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I can imagine that that's in fact a very sophisticated way of looking at the trajectory of the war while it's still going on.
Yes, and Soviet officials were cognizant of that. There was a transition point. I can't necessarily give you an exact date that suddenly somebody like Stalin says, all of a sudden, we know the war will be over. We have to not actively have hate propaganda campaigns, but there is an understanding that there will be a need to refashion Europe once the war is over, right? There's going to be a power vacuum. How do you replace that? How do you prevent Germany from attacking a third time, potentially? And so Soviet officials are always kind of towing a very, very narrow tightrope of trying to not alienate an entire group of people, but also to appease people on the home front in their home population, to bring some sort of punishment and justice to the people who wrought so much destruction upon the Soviet Union. And so the prisoners of war become sort of pawns in this game.
Yeah. Well, let's talk then about the work that they're put to. What did they do? And were they sort of assigned to the places around the POW camps, or were they assigned maybe to places that were where they moved in order to put them in places that were more devastated?
There were prisoner of war camps that operate labor camps. I'm going to focus on the forced labor camps. They operated across the entirety of the Soviet Union, or the majority of the entirety of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, if in the post-war era, there are 15 republics. The prisoners of war were in 14 out of the 15 republics. The only republic where there was not a camp, or there were no camps, was Tajikistan. So they were dispersed heavily throughout, or predominantly where the fighting was actually fought. And then they were also deployed to major industrial centers across the Soviet Union. So the Ural Mountain area within the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, that was a major site of the Soviet steel industry. And steel is necessary for post-war reconstruction, right? So they're deployed in heavy numbers to the Urals. They're not deployed to middle of nowhere regions of Siberia. It's not purely punishment for punishment's sake. The prisoners are assigned to camps, and then the camps would, based on the needs of the local industries, loan out the prisoners, right? So they could be working at a textile factory, they could be working at a coal mine, they could be working to reconstruct or construct a power plant, all sorts of different industries. I think it was something, I want to say it's like 45 or 46 economic commissariats or ministries the Soviet Union had something like 45 or 46 economic commissariats or ministries, and the prisoners of war were deployed to, I want to say, 45 of the 46 or 44 of the 46. So they were dispersed in different numbers, right, based on the priorities of post-war reconstruction needs to pretty much every sector of the Soviet economy.
And how did the commanders of these camps and or the sort of heads of the work units, how did they find that the German POWs adapted to working on civilian projects? And what I mean by that is, as a German POW, you might think, okay, I'm going to be released soon. This is temporary. But as it goes on year after year after year, I imagine that, their work ethic, if you will, starts to decline. And then when they realize they're, in a way, slave labor, it must be awfully hard to motivate them or force them to work.
You make a good point that way. A lot of arguments have been made about the economics and utility of this type of labor. Unfortunately, based on the declassified documents that I was able to access, I wasn't able to assess economic contributions in that sense, whether it was actually economical or not. What I was able to find, though, is that they did contribute. And the memoir literature certainly speaks to this, right? When they find announcements like, oh, okay, we know we just have to survive till December 31st, 1948. And then all of a sudden there's an announcement to the camps, oh, you're being delayed. There's despair in the memoirs. There's despair of the Soviet camp officials would poll the prisoners sort of to get opinions. What were they thinking? Right? There's despair in those opinion polls. But they had no choice but to work. So the way that living in the camp system was you didn't get your ration unless you met the work quota. So if you underfulfilled your work quota for the day, you got a reduced ration. So if you wanted to eat, you had to contribute.
So that's a fairly motivating factor. But you talk also about, again, you mentioned this briefly a second ago, but the diversity of the types of work. This isn't necessarily just chain gang stuff, building railroads or working in the mines. There's a lot of different things. Please elaborate. I think our listeners would love to hear a lot more about the different things. And by the way, I can imagine the people who are working at a textile factory are happier than the people who are working in the mines.
Yeah, I would imagine the textile factory was a much better assignment than the mine. Yes. Well, that's one of the other things. So the Soviet authorities wanted to get, they wanted the Germans to contribute to the best of their abilities, right? So Stalin himself has orders that say use the prisoners to the best of their capabilities. There's a standardized form that was circulated amongst the camps where the soldiers were interviewed and they were asked what their specialties, what their professions were, what their education levels were prior to entering the military, right? So did you work as a farmer who drove a tractor? Great, we might need you to drive a tractor on a farm in the Soviet Union. Were you a mechanic? Were you an architect? Were you a chemist? Medical professionals. They were employed as medical professionals again in the Soviet Union, assisting Soviet medical personnel, for example. So they tried to use the Soviet officials tried to use the prisoners to the best of their abilities, again, as a way to best get a return on the labor, right? If somebody is already trained in operating heavy machinery, fixing heavy machinery, have him do that.
You say it's impossible to really determine specifically the motivations, but do we know how many people were sent to, if you will, hard labor jobs versus sort of factory labor and other types of jobs? I'm wondering whether, a traditional political prisoner within the Soviet Union, that is a Soviet who's been sent to a gulag, is given preferential treatment over a German POW prisoner who's being sent to a work camp. You know what I mean? You've got two prisoners. One's a Soviet political prisoner who has medical training in some case, and one's a German prisoner of war who has medical training. Are they given different or better assignments, or is that impossible to determine?
It's hard to determine, but I would say, if anything, the Germans are given preferential treatment than the domestic Soviet prisoners.
Wow, that's amazing.
As far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but I think in fewer circumstances, Soviet prisoners were employed within their areas of specialty. Yeah, and the other thing too is the geography of the camp system.
Yeah.
Right? The Soviet political prison camp system, the infamous Gulag, that also had camps throughout the Soviet Union, but its most infamous camps were in inhospitable regions of the Soviet Union. It was essentially used to do like internal colonization of the Soviet Union. There were places in the far north and the far east of the Soviet Union that had vital resources. They were undeveloped, remote regions, and Soviet officials could not get free citizens to move to those places. So they used prison labor to develop, say, a gold mine or a nickel mine or a coal mine in those places. The German prisoner of war camps were not in those extraordinarily remote, harsh, extreme places. They were much more closer tied to population centers, which also is where, I mean, a lot of the fighting was, right? The majority of the
Sure,
population
sure.
is in the European parts of the Soviet Union, and those were the places that needed the reconstruction.
Right. What the Soviets would call the Western Front, but what the other allies call the Eastern Front.
Exactly, yes.
And if you look at the line, the line going down, and you have great maps in the book, you can see that very clearly. Also, you mentioned early on in the book that you use mapping and satellite imagery to sort of figure out a lot of this stuff. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so that goes back to a point I was making earlier about the economic contribution, right? In Soviet historiography in general, and this is much more in the Gulag camp, that's what's been more heavily studied since the fall of the Soviet Union. And there have been questions about the economics of the Gulag camp system. And so I kind of wanted to use the prisoners of war as a way to sort of join some of that debate because it's another group of forced laborers who are in a camp system that was heavily modeled on the Gulag camp system. Despite the fact that the Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy, there is not a centralized accounting of German prisoner of war labor statistics. That's at least declassified. So going into the Russian State Military Archive, there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of files for individual camps. There's not a central tabulation of it. And I know there had to have been central tabulations because that's how the Soviet economy ran, right? It was a centralized economy.
Oh, sure.
Somebody was totaling those numbers. I just don't know where those numbers are, and they're not declassified.
And they're not likely to be declassified under Putin
No. Correct.
In the near future, foreseeable future.
Exactly. And so I wanted to turn to Geographic Information System, or GIS mapping, to see if I could answer some of those questions using maps, right? So there was, especially in the German popular mindset, there's a trope that captivity was only in Siberia. And so miraculously, there's an encyclopedia. It was a joint German-Russian research effort. They went into the Russian State Military Archive, and they created an encyclopedia of camps. So I digitized that, and I got geographic coordinates for the camps, or as close to the camps as I could find, and I mapped those places, right? And that's how I know the majority of the camps were in the European parts of the Soviet Union, not Siberia. And then you can make other arguments that way too, right? So the camps are all on major rail corridors, major rail hubs. If you look at where coal basins are in the Soviet Union, there are a lot of camps related to where the coal industry is, and coal was one of the building blocks of Reconstruction. I also used temperature data, right? Were they in extremely harsh locations or not, climate-wise, right? None of the German prisoner of war camps were in permafrost regions, for example. So they were not
Right.
in the worst of the worst. If you're from Berlin, yes, Moscow probably feels very cold and very inhospitable. But they're also in places like the Caucasus, where, again, mountain regions too, but like, if you're in central parts of the Caucasus, like Yerevan or Tbilisi or Baku, it's not as cold.
No.
It's not snowing. It's not that mental image that we have of Siberia where it's snowing 363 days a year.
Yeah. By the way, just quickly before we get off the location aspect of it, it occurred to me that one of the things that people reading this book would be asking is, well, what about escape or potential escape? Do we have any information about how many people tried to escape, or was it because it's so far inland, even though it's in the Western Soviet Union, it's still a long way from, if you will, freedom? Do we have any notion of whether escapes were attempted and how successful they were?
I don't have a centralized accounting. Like, I don't have
Yeah.
a list that says there are this number of escapes, this many were successful, this many were unsuccessful. I think there was an understanding that a lot of them would never be successful,
Yeah.
right? Because we're talking about the vastness of the geography and people who are such outsiders who don't necessarily speak the language. There's nowhere for them to go.
Right.
So often prisoners were entrusted with vehicles in cities, for example.
Oh, okay.
Right? Like, here's this truck. You're going to drive it to the quarry. You're going to load it up with the stuff, and you're going to take it to the rail yard, the depot, for it to be shipped on somewhere else. Right? There's not the infrastructure. Okay, you have a truck. How far are you going to get on one tank of gas?
Right.
Not that far.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to get more gas. You're not going to be able to keep going. So the physical geography of the Soviet Union limits the ability for them to escape.
Yeah, that is amazing. But bringing up that example of the truck driver leads me to my next question. Like, how much do we know about the daily life of the prisoners and the type of work they did. You mentioned there's some memoir evidence of this, and that is what German prisoners would have written after the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or even some of the public opinion polling, if you will, the Soviets
Mhm.
did within the POW camps. But generally speaking, what did they go through on a day-to-day basis? I know it'll differ by region and differ by industry, but in general.
That's the thing. They had a very routine schedule. You'd get up, you'd have breakfast, you'd go to your labor assignment. You'd work your shift at the labor assignment. Some of the prisoners, they spent the nights in the camps and then they were transported to the labor site. In other situations, some factories had to build dormitories for the prisoners
Mm-hmm.
if it was too far for them to commute daily, right? Like
Yeah.
these men are on loan, you have to provide them a place to sleep at night. You're in charge of the transportation costs. So they'd get up, they'd have breakfast, they'd do their work assignment, they get lunch while they're at work, they get back to the camp, they have dinner. There were attempts to do some sort of, like, I guess you would call it recreational activities.
Yeah.
There's evidence of that in the camps, right? So again, a lot of them with an emphasis on re-education, transformation from being fascist into socialist, fashioning the new people who would be allies with the Soviet Union upon their return to Germany. They would put on plays, they would play chess. Some places had grounds for sports. They would read newspapers, they would watch films, obviously with a big propaganda angle to it.
Yeah.
In some circumstances, they were taken on excursions. So certain ones who were in Moscow, for example, were taken to see the major sites of Moscow before repatriation, again, as a way to sort of condition the prisoners into thinking that the Soviet Union was a good place, right? Like, these are our allies, they're cultured, they're smart. This is not a culture that we should despise, counteract a lot of the myths of the Nazi propaganda.
Well, I guess then my cynic's question would be, why release them at all? Why did they then, by 58, release them? Why not just keep them forever? I mean, in many ways, if they're cut off from Germany for a dozen years, you could argue, I can imagine some Soviet bureaucrats saying, well, they've been cut off with their family for a dozen years, so they've eventually become Sovietized. Let's just keep them.
Well, there are a couple of different reasons or hunches I have for this, right? This is my best educated guess based on the fractured sources I have and not being able to interview somebody like Stalin himself and say, why did you keep them?
Well, we need a new hashtag. We need a new hashtag, historian hunch.
Historian hunch. I like it. We'll make that trend. So the prisoners are released in a handful of major waves, right? So the first major wave is after capitulation, sick, injured, they go home.
Mm-hmm.
There's another wave of men in 46, 47 that coincides with a very understudied or not really known about, especially until recently, famine that hit the Soviet Union.
Right.
Everybody in the Soviet Union was suffering from the effects of the famine, free population
Yeah,
and
sure.
incarcerated population, right? So the way that the Soviets handled it was they would increase rates of repatriation so that the limited resources could be better distributed to those who are in captivity. There's another wave of repatriation in 1949 when East and West Germany officially become states, or West Germany and then East Germany, I believe, respectively, again, as like a goodwill gesture. And then there's another wave pretty soon after Stalin dies. So there's kind of like, all I can gather is that the men who were there, between 49 and 56, the number had dwindled enough that we're talking about thousands, like tens of thousands. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands. We're not talking about millions anymore. So they're not as needed as much for economic reconstruction because their numbers are so small. They're also not needed as much for economic reconstruction because Soviet economic reconstruction was well underway by 49. They're not at their pre-war levels yet. They reach that around the time that Stalin dies, but they're on the way, right? So it's not like they're needed in droves the same way. And so these remaining men seemingly are just held under Stalin's orders, right? One of the most infamous examples of this is Field Marshal Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. He, in his time in the Soviet prison camp system, becomes an ardent socialist.
All right.
The rule was you're supposed to go back to the part of Germany that you came from, like where you entered the army, where you were drafted, where you enlisted. That's how you get sent back to West Germany. That's how you get sent to East Germany. That's the reasoning. Paulus is from West Germany. He writes, I want to go to East Germany. I don't want to go to West Germany. I'm a committed socialist now. I want to help construct a socialist East Germany. And camp officials were like, this is great. This is genius. We want him. This would be a huge PR boon for us. And Stalin turns it down.
Wow.
Paulus is only released to do that mission explicitly in East Germany after Stalin's death.
Huh. And we tend to think, immediately after Stalin's death and that sort of government by committee for a few months is the sort of start of de-Stalinization, easing things up a bit. But that's interesting.
That's one of the things of de-Stalinization, right? So one of the presumptive heirs, Beria, who had been the head of the secret police and in charge of aspects of the terror and the camp system and things like that to varying degrees over time, one of his major reforms to try to stand out after Stalin dies is a release of Gulag prisoners. The Germans are also sort of involved in that release, right? There was a tradition of amnesty after a czar would die from the prison system. I don't know why they decided to carry this over into the Soviet Union, but they did. And so then eventually Khrushchev maneuvers his way into power, and he's the one who releases the final prisoners. And this is more out of concerns of the Cold War than it is of economics at all, right?
Okay.
He's trying to get better relations with West Germany. West Germany joins NATO. And this freaks out the Soviet Union. They're very upset by this. And so Khrushchev, as he's coming to power, tries to do some overtures with West Germany in hopes that if they normalize relations fully with West Germany and establish full diplomatic relations and things like that, it might be possible to work with West Germany and sway them, basically the American sphere of influence, or not totally remove them from the sphere of influence, but get West Germany to think a little bit for itself, especially with affairs with the East. And so Konrad Adenauer, the guy who's the chancellor, he goes over to the Soviet Union in September of 1955. He has a whole list of things that he wants to negotiate with the Soviet Union, and one of the sticking points, one of the things that he promises the West German population is that he will not normalize relations unless the Soviet Union agrees to return the last couple thousand prisoners of war. And Khrushchev, after days of diplomatic negotiations, finally relents and releases them. So they're used, the prisoners are held at least initially through 1949 for economics, and after 1949, they are pawns in the Cold War and pawns in Soviet German relations.
Yes, it seems like everything down to the, trade in potatoes becomes a pawn in the Cold War. It's just astounding. Well, then briefly, if you don't mind, let's talk about the way this history then is discussed in the Soviet Union in its various forms after Khrushchev, etc., because it seems to go back and forth like a lot of these things. You open the book, in fact, talking about how a Russian high school student in 2017 had sort of tried to bring this history to a broader public, and then what happened to him and everything is also very fascinating. But how does the Soviet Union try to explain to its citizens in general why this happened and the justifications for it?
There are a couple of different waves of memory and commemoration in the Soviet Union and then after the Soviet Union. At least initially in the Soviet Union, the German prisoners of war, who were generally referred to as fascists, and again, not Germans, because post-war era, there are East German allies of the Soviet Union who are socialists. There is an emphasis, though, on the fascists being captured. They are seen as symbols of Red Army victory, right? So there's one of the most famous Soviet World War II memorials is the one at the former Stalingrad, present-day Volgograd. For those of you who don't know it, or those of you who might be guessing to what I'm talking about, it's a giant statue of a woman holding a sword over a hill, right? You've probably seen it. That's just one piece of the memorial complex. It's called the Stalingrad Memorial Complex, right? There are bas-reliefs, there are sculptures, there's an eternal flame, and so on and so forth. And on the wall going into the room that houses the eternal flame, there are the cold, weary Germans being captured. And the inscription under it says, "The fascist war dogs wanted to see the Volga. The Red Army gave them this, quote, opportunity," end quote. So again, they are symbols of Red Army victory. And this memorial complex opens roughly around the 20th anniversary of the Second World War. So in the mid-60s. Jump forward 20 more years to the 40th anniversary of the Second World War. We're well into the Cold War. We're well into the establishment of East Germany and socialist German friendship. And so for the 40th anniversary, there's a new museum that opens, and it's the Memorial Museum of German Anti-Fascists. So there were a handful of Germans, like German socialists and communists, who fled Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union for exile, right, to escape persecution. During the war, they worked to create German language pro-Soviet anti-Hitler propaganda to broadcast to the German population. Once German prisoners were captured, these German socialists were also involved in re-education programs for the Germans, right? Because they are German socialists. They know the culture, they know the language, they're tasked with creating these materials. A handful of other Germans who joined up in these anti-fascist programs, right? There was the League of German Officers, there was the National Committee for Free Germany. A lot of these associations attempted to create anti-Hitler propaganda that was basically like, surrender, give up, don't fight the Soviets. If you get captured by the Soviets, you're not going to be summarily executed. That's a lie. It's in your best interest to give up fighting this senseless war. So there were actual German anti-fascists who did, in some small ways, contribute to the Soviet war effort. And so for the 40th anniversary, there's the opening of this museum that commemorates this. And it's just outside Moscow in a place called Krasnogorsk. It's now part of like the urban sprawl of Moscow. And that was the former officer camp. So this gets unveiled at the 40th anniversary. And then the Germans are seen first as captives and symbols of victory. Then they're seen as, in a limited capacity, some allies in the war effort. And then there's a new age of commemoration after the Soviet collapse, when Germans were finally allowed onto the graveyard sites to create commemorations for their family members.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There was an exchange between the Russian Federation and Germany that basically said, Russia, after the Soviet collapse, was like, Germany, we would like to continue to be able to maintain our war graves and monuments on German soil. And Germany said, great, in return, we want the ability to do the same on Russian soil.
Mm-hmm.
So for the first time, Germans were allowed to go over and erect their own monuments in cemeteries and things like that. So the Germans were finally able to mourn their war dead as war dead family members.
But then how does that change in more recent years?
Yeah, things have gotten complicated in the past few years.
Yeah, sorry to laugh, but it is amazing how complicated things get when you read this part of the book.
Yeah, Putin has brought back the memory of the Second World War as something to really foster Russian nationalism, right? The Victory Day parade is back on Red Square on May 9th. The troops are out, the tanks are out, the ICBMs, and so on and so forth. So between 1991 and I'd say about 2016, 2017, there was more open discussion of the Second World War and things like this. In my experience, I was not ever forbidden to see documents. In my experience, Russians were always forthcoming and happy to talk about this with me. They're like, yep, they rebuilt things. They built this. Do you see this apartment block back there? The Germans, they built it. It's really good, high quality, because it was built by the Germans. They were proud of having the Germans construct things for them, right? Because German built has a huge association with quality. So they're proud of that. They didn't have any qualms with what I was saying, where I was like, yep, seemingly they were used for reconstruction. Yes, some punishment, but economic needs seem to outweigh that. And they're like, yep, we don't have any issues with that argument. But the issue that you're bringing up is this high school student who came across some lost graves of German prisoners of war deep in the heart of the Urals region, right? So there's no question that these men died in the war. These men were captives who died while they were working at a camp. Unclear why, how, circumstances, whatever, but they found this grave. And so this student and his classmates and teachers, for whatever reason, they went to Germany to give a speech in front of the Bundestag, and he basically implied that these Germans were innocent victims of the Second World War, which you could make that argument, right? Like, he was just a guy who got captured, who died in POW captivity. He didn't die in war. Perhaps he killed Soviets, perhaps he didn't. We don't know the situation of this. But his comment was seen as inflammatory, and the state prosecutor general of Russia launched an investigation into him for rehabilitation of Nazism, right? Things that are illegal to talk about.
Yeah, now let's explain that for a second. Maybe not a direct translation, but of the title of the crime, but rehabilitation of Nazism in Russia in this period you're talking about, the late 20-teens, is actually a crime.
Yes. So you're not supposed to promote Nazism in any way. Right? Like, that is a crime. That was a law that was enacted within the past 10 years.
So they're trying to say that this kid sort of is not, rather than just telling the story of what happened to these POWs, he's also trying to rehabilitate Nazism.
Right. Yes. The Russian state was like, what you're saying about these Germans is bad, right? It could be misconstrued. It could be understood as you saying that it's okay that they were fighting and killing Soviet citizens, Russian citizens. It's okay that they were doing that, right? You're absolving them of having been the enemies during the war. And the Russian government doesn't want that. Partially because there was an incident with some of the this new law code stems from anti-Putin movements, right? So this law was created partially as a way to attack anti-Putin dissidents, right? There was a
Right. Okay.
situation where somebody called Putin into question, attacked Putin. And so somebody who is an anti-Putin dissident attacked a war veteran for having supported Putin or something like that, like ridiculed this war veteran. And so Putin made it illegal to disparage war veterans, to bring back certain aspects of the war as a way to attack his political opposition. And so this student gets caught up in this in a relatively innocuous, innocent situation where he was just saying World War II was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Soviets certainly suffered. Innocent Germans who were drafted, a 17-year-old, 18-year-old who's drafted, sent to the front, gets captured and dies in a prisoner of war camp. He probably also wasn't really doing so well during the war. But it's all weaponized, taken out of context, and applied to punish people in the current political climate.
Yeah, just astounding. And it just brings us back to this original point we started the show with. World War II just continues to be not only more stuff discovered about it, but it continues to be used politically in all sorts of ways in almost all parts of the globe. It's just the never-ending topic. I often joke to friends of mine who want to get into podcasting. I say, well, either choose the American Civil War or choose World War II and just do that, because that's the only way to, frankly, make money. Well, Professor, this has been just a wonderful discussion. And of course, like I said, World War II being sort of infinitely deep in terms of what's more left to study. Your book is almost infinitely deep because we've only skated over the surface. There's so much more in it. It's obviously on the Buzzkill bookshelf. We want people to go out there and get it and read it, it's partly just so you can learn more about the Soviet Union in the war and immediately after the war. We, especially in the United States, just don't know enough about this. But anyway, it's a long way of saying I think this work is very important, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and giving me a chance to talk about my book.
And it's just out. It's just out. What came out a few days ago. You were on social media unboxing it practically as we watched.
I was unboxing it, yes.
So again, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And we will talk to all of you out there next week.